Hello, everyone. Welcome to St. Louis County Library's virtual program, How Native Landscaping Makes a Difference, presented as part of the Partners for Native Landscaping webinar series. I'm Sarah Kuntz-Jones, Adult Programming Coordinator for St. Louis County Library. Before we get started, I wanted to bring to your attention a few helpful tips in case this is your first Zoom program with us. This is a webinar, which means you should be able to see and hear us, but we cannot see or hear you. We are recording, so this will be available on our YouTube channel within a few days, and you will receive an email with the link to the YouTube posting when it is available. We have captioning available in the webinar. You can click the caption button at the bottom of your screen to hide them, to make them larger or smaller, whatever you need to get the most out of today's program. If you experience any difficulties with your connection, we do recommend you exit the program, move closer to your Wi-Fi router, wherever you may be, and click that link again to come right back to us. We will have the chat turned on eventually. It is off right now, so keep track of questions you have. There'll be opportunities to ask those, and they will be responded to as we have time in this presentation today. So, remember, please, that you don't have to have a library card or even be a resident of St. Louis County to attend our programs, whether those are virtual or in person. We hope you enjoy yourself and learn something new today, and please do share that with your family and friends. Today's program is a part of the Partners for Native Landscaping webinar series. We are delighted to be a partner and host for these programs. But the partners are also hosting an in-person workshop and plant sale on April 15th from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. And that will be at Powder Valley Conservation Nature Center. And then they'll also have a native plant fair with Beyond Housing on April 30th. Links to those, or to find out more about that, I'll share the link to Partners for Native Landscaping here in a moment. But in particular, I want to mention the next two programs in the series, the next two webinars in the series are gardening. Our Garden is for the Birds, so that will be on Tuesday, March 28th at 7 p.m., as well as Shade Gardening with Native Plants, and that will be next Wednesday, March 29th at 2 p.m. You can register for these programs or any St. Louis County Library program by going to www.slcl.org/events. And please remember that you can also catch up on most any program you missed by checking out the library's YouTube channel. And all of the previous recordings for this webinar series are available there for viewing. So feel free to check that out as you have time. In addition to the links I'm going to share in the chat here, I also want to point out that I'll be sharing a survey to provide the Partners for Native Landscaping with feedback about today's webinar that will help them in planning next year's series. So we appreciate you taking the time to fill that out at some point. All right, but now I would love to introduce you to our presenter today, Dr. Gerardo Camilo. Gerardo Camilo is a native of Puerto Rico, where he grew up and attended the University of Puerto Rico at Mayagüez, and he moved to Texas in 1986 to attend Texas Tech University, where he earned a master's degree in entomology in 1988. After completing the MS, he moved to the biology department and earned his doctorate in zoology in 1992. And from 1992 to 1995, Dr. Camilo was a postdoctoral associate at the Institute for Tropical Ecosystem Studies of the University of Puerto Rico, where he worked on food web ecology. He joined the faculty at St. Louis University in 1995, and he is currently full professor and runs the Billiken Bee Lab. You can find more information on his website, CamiloBeelab.com, which I will also share in the chat here in a moment. But I'd love at this point to thank you for being with us, Dr. Camilo, and turn things over to you.
Well, Sarah, thank you very much for having me. Thank you for the county library. I love libraries. As a kid, you know, I spent a lot of time, and as a grad student, I even slept in libraries. So yeah, I'm very, very thankful for having me, and thanks everyone that is attending. I will try to do my best and tell you kind of like the story of what is happening in my lab, and maybe I'm not going to be talking too much about how to really work on your yard or what to do, but because they have been multiple cases like that in which I know my previous grad students have talked about it. What I'm be talking about it today is slightly different. I want to see what are the consequences, what are the implications of landscaping with native plants, and can the individual homeowner actually have an impact in biodiversity conservation? And that's a big question, because usually when people are asked about, what can you do about climate change, what can I do about saving the rainforest, what can you do about saving the planet, many times those questions are so big and so overwhelming that people either ignore them or we feel incapable of. And neither one of those are good options. So hopefully today I'll give you, a little bit of perspective on how individual homeowners can make a serious difference in biodiversity loss, and specifically pollinator biodiversity. But before I get there, I want to acknowledge, all the various collaborators I have that have contributed to this presentation. As I said, this is a science story, but it's also, just a plain story. I'm going to keep all the statistics. I'm going to keep all the mathematics and everything. As you can see in this cartoon that my students made, I am the person that works with a lot of the number crunching and the modeling behind the scenes, but I want to think of myself also more of a storyteller. Okay? And so for that, I need to acknowledge Dr. Sasha Heath, a previous postdoc in my lab. She worked with the birds. Nina Fogel, who's a current grad student over here. She works with the bees. Trey Hall, who is also a grad student in my lab. He's doing the mosquitoes. And Dr. Lara Zwaron at University of Missouri, St. Louis, who has been the one that has helped with the communication aspects of the research. So let me hold on a second. It's kind of stuck here. I see, said the blind man. I need to move it back again, and let me again. Hold on a second. I know what's going on because it already happened to me before. Okay, so now we go back. There we go. So let's talk first about cities and urban growth. So about more than a decade ago, about half of the world's population already lived in a city. So that meant back then that almost 3.5 billion people lived in a city. Yet by 2050, which is barely 27 years down the road, the world population will be sitting close to 10 billion people, and 2 out of every 3 people in the world will be living in a city. That means that urban growth, the generation of this environment that we call the city, represents the largest expansion and the greatest migration of humans from any environment, any natural, rural, small town, into this new massive megalopolis environment that we have created. Okay? And this is a little bit outdated, but at the end of last year, we already hit 8 billion people in the planet, which means that this 9.2 billion is probably a very conservative estimate. That means that you have places like Lagos, Nigeria, and Kinshasa, Uganda, in which, for example, in Nigeria, in Lagos, you're adding 85 people to a city per hour. So these are additions, per hour. every hour of a day, day in, day out, 365 days a year. And this is expected to continue for the next couple of decades. The consequences of that growth means that the urban infrastructure, the total amount of this environment that we call the city, must double over the next 30 years in order to accommodate that amount of growth. That expansion of the urban environment, coupled with the growth of the human population, implies that we humans are placing a huge amount of stress and strain onto the natural environment that is responsible for food production, is responsible for clean water production, from clean air production, for climate mitigation, etc., etc., etc. So when we're talking about the growth of the urban environment, yes, you can have growth like you saw in the previous slide that is very condensed, is very dense. You grow up and you can then fit a lot more people in a smaller amount of space. But usually what we have observed is that with increased economic power, as people earn more money and become more affluent, they tend to like to live in places that have some people do prefer to live in areas that have smaller population densities. And this is the case of the so-called urban sprawl. Okay, so as you can see here, what you have is that a much smaller number of people is occupying a much greater amount of space. Okay? So with urban sprawl, what you have is basically an expansion, a consumption of space with relatively little concern about urban planning. Okay, so you can see in this image, many of these roads basically lead nowhere. Okay, and you don't see services, you don't see parks. In a lot of the area that is used for development like these tend to be areas that used to be agricultural. So as you can imagine, you know, agriculture is easier, is more economical, is much more efficient when you do it in a place that is flat and have water available. Okay? So urban sprawl then has two consequences. The first consequence of the urban sprawl is at a larger scale. This is called landscape homogenization. And what you see in this example over here, you can see that you can have two very extreme environment. One is very, very dry, like around Phoenix, Arizona, and one is very, very wet, like that around Miami, Florida. And yet with the use of, you know, technology, fertilizers, bringing in lawn, bringing in, you know, all sort of various inputs, you have a really tough time determining where these images were taken. Okay, so it could be Phoenix, it could be anywhere in Texas, it could be Minnesota, it could be Florida, it doesn't matter. You end up that everywhere that you go, it looks more or less the same. So think about, you know, restaurants, you know, it doesn't matter where you go in the United States, you will always find an Olive Garden and, you know, an Applebee's, you know, a McDonald's. But the question is, you know, do you want to go all the way out to Phoenix, Arizona to eat an Applebee's? No, you don't. Okay? You can go to the Applebee's here in St. Louis. So think about natural species, you know, bees, birds, lizards, frogs that live in these various environments. They are adapted to these very unique conditions that occur in these specific environments. Yet when you create a city and you create suburbs, you are basically taking away all their food choices. That's one of the things happening. You're taking away all their food choices and you're forcing them to eat in Applebee's and Olive Garden. The second impact of this urban sprawl, the second impact of urban growth in general, not just urban sprawl, is the creation of so-called novel ecosystems. These are ecosystems that have never, ever, ever occurred in nature in the past. These are environments that consist of people, consist of plants, consist of animals, consist of microbes, consist of soils that come from all sort of parts of the world. I'm here in my house in St. Louis in the Shaw neighborhood, and I'm looking out the street and I can see trees that are not native to here. They're native from Asia. I can also see grasses that, you know, are not native from the Midwest. I can see lots of plants, you know, inside my house as well outside the house that naturally do not occur here. So what you're doing is you're tossing plants and animals and microbes and all sort of stuff together in this big pot. You shake them around, and whatever survive is because it can interact with the species that are present and with the other species that you're bringing in, and somehow find a way to make a living. So we're going to talk about two extremes. So this is a continuum, but we're going to look at two extremes. One of them is called the intentional novel ecosystem. Okay? So these are ecosystems that require large amounts of inputs. You know, so when you have a green lawn like that, that contains a single species of grass, okay, you have to mow that lawn, you have to fertilize that lawn, then you have to put you know, pesticides to kill the other plant species that you don't want there. You don't want dandelions, you don't want plantago, you don't want any of that stuff if you want it to keep looking that homogeneous. And at the same time, you have to put, you know, grub killer, and you have to put a lot of chemicals in there to maintain that one single species looking the way that you have it there. On the other extreme, when you take all human impact, all human, you know, inputs out of there, you have an unintentional ecosystem. And this is what we observe in many of the vacant lots that we have in the north side of the city. This is, you know, just stop mowing your lawns for a couple, 3 weeks, you know, and what's going to happen, besides the fact that your neighbor is probably going to complain to you or call the lawn police, is that you will start seeing lots of teeny tiny flowers show up in your lawn. And it's because essentially nature hates monotony. Okay? The monoculture, the one species only, goes against everything and everywhere that nature has evolved in order to be sustainable. So the question that we're going to pose is, can we strike a balance, of course, between what you see, the image that you see on the top of the slides up here versus the image that you have down here, okay? This one, of course, tends to be tied greatly with property values, and that is many times used as a way of making sure that everybody in the neighborhood is on the same page as I am, okay? And this one over here is, even though might be cool for attracting bees and stuff, is not necessarily also what people find appealing. Okay. So now let's see how is then that combination between, you know, urban sprawl and urban density affects, you know, what species are found in a city, and why is it that biodiversity appears to be so low when you are in an urban environment. Okay? So when it comes to, let's say, mammals, you know, you go to a city, you come in St. Louis and you think of mammals, you think about raccoons, you think about possum, squirrels, and bunnies. Okay, and if you go to Cleveland, what are the mammals of Cleveland? Raccoons, squirrels, bunnies. You know, when you go to Chicago, what are the mammals you tend to find in Chicago? Raccoons, squirrel, bunnies, you know, the occasional coyote. But that is what we mean by ecological homogenization, that when you go into a city, it doesn't matter which city you have, you always have the same mammal species. The same occurs for birds, that you have robins, you have doves, you have cardinals. In every city that you go anywhere in the Midwest, you end up with the same birds, and the same with trees and a bunch of other different species of plants and animals. Okay? So what happens is, as you move from the natural environment to the rural environment and then to the urban environment, you lose species. So that is called a filtering effect. Well, when it comes to bees, what we have observed is that bees, originally we thought the bees were somewhat insensitive. That was our original idea, that bees did not care if you're in natural, rural, or urban environment. But as we kept doing more and more research, what we found was that no, bees are sensitive, it's just they're sensitive in a different way. They're sensitive to the agricultural environments, and they're sensitive to some kinds of suburban environments. Okay? So the question is, why is that the case? And that is then when, so basically we know that cities are not necessarily biological deserts, but there are certain species. So bees are, can be incredibly diverse in cities. Ground spiders are now also super common in ground cities. So the more we study these issues, the more aware we know that there's something going on that allows many things to live in cities. The question is, we don't know exactly what it is. And I think today you'll see a little bit of a reason why. And it's, of course, thanks to many of the people that are doing this. So we started with a basic scientific hypothesis called human facilitation. And what I mean by this is that somehow, people can learn and do things that then affects how they're treating their lawns and what is it that they're planting. That leads to an increase in floral diversity, especially of natives. And as you increase the floral diversity, you end up with an increase in bee diversity at the site of the house. And once you have certain number of houses and enough places, then the total citywide bee diversity also goes up, which then leads to further increases. People get more, as we communicate what is happening across the city, more and more people get interested in it, and then they start changing their own lawn care and planting decisions, and the circle keeps going on, and hopefully we end up with a very large bee community in the city. The ultimate, many of you may have seen these. I bet you that we have it in our libraries, is a big famous book by Doug Tallamy, professor of ecology in Vermont. And Doug proposes that as we change our lawn practices and we change our planting decisions, then nature will come to your home. So that is basically a simple way of putting the theory of human facilitation, in common terms. And as the number of people in a neighborhood and in the city keeps adding and adding, then we should see what is called a spillover effect. And when you think about it, many of you are also in, part of Wild Ones or part of the wildlife, habitat program. And many of you may also be, in Bring Conservation Home. There are a very large number of these programs that have popped all over the United States over the last decade. And just recently, my grad student, Nina Fogel, along with Dr. Lazaron from OMSL, we have submitted a manuscript in which we basically have a total list of everything we had until last year. Since then, we have discovered 6 more that have emerged in the last year or so. So this is very good news. But their standards change. In some of them, all you have to do is you sign a pledge that I'm going to do it, and that's all you have. So it's kind of like a participation trophy, as opposed to Bring Conservation Home that have much more strict the strict requirements, and that's why we really like Bring Conservation Home, and we have partnered with them in order to really understand what is happening. But basically, the idea is to go through something like this to something like that. Okay, so if you do that, you know, you're saving money, you're saving chemicals, you're saving yourself not having to mow. Go and grab a beer, watch the football game, don't mow, and your bees will thank you. Okay, so this is probably many of you have seen this in the Bring Conservation Home. There is a healthy yard pledge in which you say you're going to reduce pesticide use, conserve water, protect water, so on and so forth. And the question is, will this make a difference? And of course, what we have is that we see that there is then very specific guidelines about what it requires to achieve the various levels of certification. Well, not only did we took advantage of these levels of certification to then use them as treatments in an experiment or in a very large experiment, but we also used the individuals that did not get the certification. So they had the consultation, but they did not get the certification. They never bothered to make a change. They left their lawn. They said it's too much work. You know, I don't have the time. I don't have the money. You know, whatever the reason is, you know, COVID hit, whatever. They decided not to go through the certification process, but they still remain part of Bring Conservation Home. So those individuals were then used as a control group. They represent the average practice of their neighborhood relative to those people in the neighborhood that were silver or gold or platinum. Okay, so we have then, at the same time, we also survey Bring Conservation Home. And at the time, so this is in 2019, there were about 1,700 homes enrolled with, you know, almost, you know, I would say like 40% of them were in the non-certified class. So we had non-certified, silver, gold, and platinum. That means that from east to west, we had about 140 kilometers of variation. And then north to south, we had about 120 kilometers. Okay? So that then allows us to do two things. Not only are we comparing and contrasting the various levels of certification, we can also compare and contrast the homes that are in the urban environment to the homes that are in the suburban environment versus homes that are in the exurban environment. So by exurban, we mean areas that are still kind of urban, but you have very large. So these are people that tend to have, you know, 2 or 3 acres in their home. And the homes are not agricultural. So there's no agriculture, it's lawn, just a big lawn. And the houses are separated, you know, by significant different distances from one to the other. So that's the plus side. The downside is that there was very little variation among homeowners. And we know by a lot of studies from various other places that you need to have different ages, you need to have different incomes, you need to have different races, because that leads to different people planting different things. You know, we have seen that, you know, when you look at immigrants from Africa, or you look at immigrants from Southeast Asia or from Latin America, they tend to plant stuff that reminds them of home. Okay? So we know then that if you don't have too much variation in income and age and so on and so forth, you do not have much variation in what is being planted. And that's kind of like we have observed too. By the same token, if you are taking part of Bring Conservation Home. And furthermore, you want to enroll yourself in a study, that means that you're part of the choir. You're a very conservation conscious individual. Okay, so you have to take these results with a little bit of a grain of salt. This goes even further, in which, of course, many of these people are also part of the Audubon Society. So they feed birds, they keep their cats, most of the cats, indoors, and they treat windows to reduce bird strikes, so on and so forth. So this is the choir, okay? And it's important that we address the choir. The problem is that the choir is a very teeny tiny sliver of all the people that live in St. Louis. So from that, we went down to 339 people, houses that contributed. And from there, we subsample and we put people in different projects, okay? So that's how we deal with the treatment. How we deal with urbanization. Well, along with the Taylor Geospatial Institute at St. Louis University, we have a lot of data concerning all sort of important measures that, environmental things that change as you go from natural areas to downtown areas, and you can actually see it when you drive around. You're in a very rural area. You see very little impervious surface. There are no parking lots. There are no malls. There are no, not lots of roads, and the roads may not be paved, so on and so forth. As you go, the same thing with light. At night you're in the middle of nowhere. It's going to be very pitch black. You're in middle downtown. It's almost like if you were, in the daylight, so on and so forth. So we use all these parameters that you see here as variables to analyze the data in order to determine what are the effects of urbanization on biodiversity. So what were the research questions? Basic, is Bring Conservation Home really having the impact that it's been proposed to have, and if it does or if it doesn't, what are the mechanisms? How is that the processes, the underlying processes of homeowners, and what is it that they're doing in their yards that leads to those differences, okay? And the next question that we are going to be posing in the near future is this last one. How is then that biodiversity is interacting and persisting? And that's a much longer term question that we're not really addressing, at this event, at this time, as well as the last one, at what time, how many people do you need in any one neighborhood, in any one city? How many people do you need to have change their lawn practices for the city to become not just a refuge, but also then become a source? So you have that spillover effect. So let's talk about the birds first. Dr. Sasha Heath is the one that led this part of the study. She is a bird expert, which I am not. Okay? And what we know, the first thing we need to know is that urbanization is a major threat to bird diversity and bird species all over the world. And as I mentioned, as the amount of urbanization keeps increasing and the number of people keeps going up, these threats are only going to increase. And this is the reason why we think also that the urbanization gradient is so important. So you can imagine two houses that are of equal size, of equal age, and they both have the same certification level. So in this case, the two houses are very comparable, and they're both certified gold, meaning they have, the various multiple canopy layers. They have lots of native species, but one house is way out in West County, and is embedded by a lot of forest. The other house is essentially, near downtown. So as you can see here, the surrounding environment, and we call this surrounding environment in ecology, we call it the matrix, okay? The matrix that surrounds this gold certified house is completely different of the matrix that surrounds this house over here. So it's not only that your decisions matter, but where is your house located will matter a lot for the birds. Okay? So for these, we identify a smaller subset of 63 homes. So you can see that we have, for this purpose, we lump the gold and platinum certified houses, and they were done in, urban, suburban, and exurban environment. And in each of these houses, we then put a digital recorder called an AudioMuff, and they were put in these little poles. So you can see a contrast here. So on your left here and left of the screen, you see that here is one of those AudioMuff, and this is then a platinum certified house versus this house that is a silver certified house. So you can see that even at this scale, we expect to see certain differences. The devices recorded for 2 hours before sunset, then through the night, and then until 3 hours of sunset. The recorders were not continuous. They were only done for 1 minute every 10 minutes. Okay. And even with that, we ended up with over 177,000 recordings of 1 minute in length. So that's almost 3,000 hours, which is a terabyte of data. That recorded data has to be clean. So you have to remove, road noises, and you need to remove wind noises, and you need to remove, jackhammers and all of that out of the picture until you're left only with the bird sounds. Then the bird sounds have to then be identified to each of the specific birds that we have in the city. And then you count them. You see how many you have in houses that were silver certified in the exurban, silver certified in the suburban, silver certified in the urban, so on and so forth. And then you can analyze the data. And we have one species here, and the news are not that great. This is the Carolina wren, which is a bird that generally is well adapted to the environment. But as you can see here in the city of St. Louis, as the amount of urbanization increases, the probability of hearing the Carolina wren in the city goes essentially to 0. So that means that there is something about the city of St. Louis that is not really that welcoming to the Carolina wren. We are working now through probably about another 60 or 70 species of birds, and we hope to have those results sometime over the summer. So let's talk about the bees. Okay, so now we go from something that requires a lot of space to something that requires very little space. Okay, and there is a lot of bees. Okay, the honeybee is just one of about 21,000 to 23,000 different species of bees. The honeybee is also a domesticated animal. A honeybee is also, think about a honeybee just essentially like a chicken of the bee world. Okay, so when it comes to bees, unlike birds, St. Louis City is a very bee diverse environment. Okay, in fact, St. Louis hosts basically St. Louis is hosting nearly 50% of all the bee species we have in the entire state. For this subset of the study, we look at 45 houses. And the way we did these is that, my students and myself at time in the summer, we had a break, we would go to each house once a month, and then we would collect both the plant data. We wanted to collect what plants were blooming at that moment. And then we would also target hand netting the bees that we were observing. So as you can see here, these are all the bees that came out of a single home. Okay, and then after they're sorted by house, they are identified to species. As you can imagine, trying to tell which species each of these bees belongs to is very tedious and time consuming, but we got through it, especially my grad student, Nina Fogel. And then once you do that, then you can tell how many bees you have each day of the month, each month, so on and so forth. And what we see is that there is an effect on plant diversity, that as you go from houses that are not certified to houses that are silver certified, and then houses that are either gold and platinum certified, they do have greater abundance. So we know that the plant diversity is going up. Is the bee diversity going up? Well, first, the abundance, how many bees you have regardless. And we see is that in the city, doesn't matter at all, really doesn't. That the number of bees that you have is about the same regardless of the certification level. But when you go to the suburbs, it really matters a lot, okay? So the suburbs seems to be the place where changing your practices will matter a lot. And what's even more interesting is then than the exurbs in areas when people have a large amount of lawn and they just plant a little bit. So these are silver certified here. A very little effort can go a long way. So that's the total number of bees. How many different kinds of bees you have? Well, it seems that the urban environment, it really doesn't matter. Okay. And we think is, houses in the urban environment are very close to each other. Many times you have houses that are in the program and you look at the houses across the street and has as many flowers as and it's not certified, it's not part of the program, but it has as many flowers as the house that is certified. In the suburban environment, it really doesn't matter too much. It seems there are not that many bees, and it seems that the suburbs are the place where bees go to die. And finally, back again to the exurbs, that's where a very small amount of effort can be a huge deal. Now, a little bit back about the suburbs. Remember, this is aggregate. This is all the suburbs across the entire metro area that we sample. What we have found is that certain suburbs have much more diversity than other suburbs. So we definitely know that Webster and Kirkwood really have many more bees than just about anybody else's. So once more, back to the idea. In the urban environment, very teeny tiny lots and a few plants here and there, what happens is you have the fact that 3, 4, 5 houses are behaving like a very large house in the exurban. And bees have very, the distances are so very short that they can fly all over the place. That is not the case in the suburban. Okay, in the suburban, you may plant, your lot, but having 4 or 5 houses to the next house that may have flowers might be an impediment for many bees that are very teeny tiny and can only fly very short distances. Okay. So quickly about mosquitoes. So now let's talk about the dreaded mosquitoes. So one of the biggest complaints and most common complaints that all these programs face, one of the issues that they say, oh, we don't want you to grow your lawn. We don't want you to grow lots of plants in your yard, is people say that will lead to increase in mosquito abundances, which then makes, enjoying your backyard very annoying. And second, more importantly, it can lead to increased risk of disease transmission like West Nile virus and Zika and so on and so forth. So we were very interested in asking that question. And St. Louis is a great place to study mosquitoes because most of the species that pose a risk to public health are found in St. Louis or very close to St. Louis. Okay, so that meant that this was a perfect place to then ask that question and determine, are these programs not only increasing bee diversity and increasing good stuff, are they also increasing the bad stuff, the bad players? Okay. So the basic question here, of course, is does backyard conservation somehow affect the abundance and diversity of mosquitoes? So in order to answer that question, we say, well, if what you pledge when you're doing your Bring Conservation Home program, if you practice that, then we should not see an increase in mosquitoes, because you should be emptying your water containers. You should be cleaning your water bath. You should be maintaining your trees and plants in your backyard. And therefore, backyard conservation should not lead to an increase in mosquito abundances. Okay? So for this, then we use another subset of 42 homes, but notice the overall way of selecting the houses still the same, in which we have non-certified, silver certified, and then we still lump gold and platinum, and we have them in the urban, in the suburban, and then the exurban environment. So the so-called experimental design still holds. We did two kinds of sampling. So these are gravid sampling. So these are the ones in which the female goes and lays an egg. And then we did with the eggs then get brought back into the lab and raised, and we then identify which mosquito were those eggs from. And then we did also some hand vacuuming last year, but we're still working through that data. But for this, we can say that essentially the overall diversity of mosquitoes did not change, regardless of the level of certification. Okay. The second thing that we did observe, which is really interesting, is that when it comes to the total abundance of mosquitoes, how many mosquitoes you have in your backyard, in the exurban environment is where you have the least amount of mosquitoes. And you have to take this with a little bit of grain of salt, because in this case, we think what happens is that a neighbor or some of one of our participants, this data point over here, I think the neighbor essentially called one of the mosquito services and they may have sprayed. So this is why this value is a little bit low. But regardless, notice that here is then in the suburban, you have gold and platinum certified versus non-certified, no difference. And then in the urban, again, no significant difference. This point might also have been that some of the neighbors sprayed, but essentially there was no real difference. So you can have a very lush lawn, and as long as you're taking care of all that lawn and you do not have water containers, you're probably not going to get mosquitoes. Okay? So the main thing is that take-home message here is that a well-maintained, healthy yard does not lead to an increase in mosquito in your yard, but can it decrease the risk of mosquito-borne diseases? And it seems that the answer might be yes. And here's how it goes. Okay. So if you have an environment that has very large diversity, then, the West Nile virus that lives in a bird, cannot find a host in, let's say, squirrels or other stuff. But as you lose biodiversity, then you are losing, many other host species, and thus is likely that then you will end up with the disease agent that can find a common host that then can transmit back to people. And that's what we call the dilution effect hypothesis. And that seems to be the case we're observing in St. Louis. It's kind of weak, but we're observing. Okay. So to wrap up, the overall evidence for plants and bees is that these programs work, or at least Bring Conservation Home works very well. Okay? And if you increase your plant diversity and you maintain your yard, there is all the evidence indicates that there is no increase whatsoever in mosquitoes and that there's no increase in risk disease. The bad news is that for some birds, that might not be enough. Okay? For some birds, the amount of space that they require is much greater, and it will take not just individual homeowners, but it will take the cooperation of local governments, the cooperation with conservation agencies, and a larger communal effort to make our cities more welcoming to a greater diversity of bird species. So with that said, can we strike a balance? I think we can. The evidence is piling up, not just in my research, but that of Dr. Mary Gardner at Ohio State, Dr. Gail Langelotto at Oregon. So the evidence starting to pile up that yes, individual homeowners can make a difference, and you can make the difference here, and you can make it for our pollinators that are also super important for food production. So yes, as the program said, yes, we can. Okay. So with that said, I want to thank a lot of people that have contributed to this research. As I said, I've given a very broad overview of what we have found, but in order to get to that point that you can have that much data and you can tell a good solid story requires large amounts of people and efforts. And especially I want to thank Mitch Lichman, who retired from St. Louis Audubon, a couple of years back, was the person that, welcomed me in order to do this research. And of course, I want to thank St. Louis County Library for inviting me. And if time permits, I guess we can answer some questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Camillo. That was so interesting. And waiting for some comments to come in. I just opened the chat, and someone just said that this presentation has helped provide better direction on how to affect change than they've heard before. So thank you for that. We were just talking about with last night's webinar about rainscaping solutions. We were discussing how it does take team, it does take this cooperation, not only among us in our community, but of the different agencies, different actors in our communities and our environment to support these kinds of changes that you've made a really good case for. putting it to the forefront as things like that. Those population numbers are just mind-blowing, that's where we're headed. I'm always surprised, even though
we're kind of in the United States already 70%. Yeah, actually, we might be approaching 80% of the population lives in an urban environment.
Yeah, and it seems, it's something that we don't think about too often. At least I don't in my day to day.
No, exactly. I have a colleague who moved to Indonesia to a university there to study the exact same thing. He's also studying bees, and he says it's ridiculous how the number is like that. Photographs in which all the cranes is like that in his eyes. You see the cranes going up every day, one after the other, and it's like, you're trying to breathe and it's choking.
Driving into I live right on the edge of the city limit. Lived in the city for a long time. My daughter still goes to school in the city, and looking over at kind of what's going on north, you see the evidence of that even here. So we do have a couple of questions, and so one of them is, since you talk about bees and you're the bee lab, they have a question about we're doing what we can to support pollinators in our communities, and if you've planted a pollinator garden, we also have a huge, being St. Louis, we have a huge mosquito problem as well. And different neighbors have different approaches to how they handle that. So if someone else is spraying in their neighborhood, is there anything that we can do to
Yeah.
keep
So
our
first of all,
garden healthy and happy?
spraying for mosquitoes. The evidence, the overwhelming scientific evidence is that it doesn't work.
Mhm.
But getting the science to communicate it requires money, and requires fighting preconceived ideas that you want to do something and you want to do it now.
Mhm.
And it doesn't work. It's ineffective. You may kill a few mosquitoes, but you're going to kill a lot of other stuff along the way.
Mhm.
No if, answer, buts. The absolutely best, is not to have the problem in the first place, which is to make sure that you flipped over all, you don't have standing water, that you don't have standing water. In the places that we have found large amounts of mosquitoes, and my grad student is an expert on this because that's all he did. After he graduated from college, he worked first in the private sector with the mosquito company. Then he was a mosquito control for Jeff County. And he says he immediately started looking around your property.
Mhm.
So it might not be your property, it's somewhere in there. And the one that we have in University City was essentially that the water of the neighbor who was watering the bejesus out of the lawn was pulling in, in a easement, and then he was also fertilizing. So two things you need for mosquitoes is nutrients and standing water that becomes hot.
Mhm.
So the neighbor was, and he's the one that eventually turns around and calls the mosquito company because he had lots of mosquitoes. Of
Mhm.
course, because you're watering the bejesus out of the lawn and then fertilizing it. And yeah, so we're shooting ourselves in the foot kind
Yeah.
of stuff. So that's the best way to do, not only check your property, check your neighbor's property. I live in the city, and we had a neighbor that had tons of plants in the backyard.
Mhm.
And the moment we get mosquitoes, I just would walk into her yard and I just toppled all the saucers. I don't care.
Yeah. That's a good point. Like, it doesn't take much to, to overlook the conditions that make mosquitoes very happy.
Yeah.
And I think last week we had Mervyn Wallace from the Missouri Wildflower Nursery, and he mentioned that there is a native carnivorous plant that I think he said bladderwort. I need to look this up. Bladderwort or ladderwort that will eat mosquitoes. So if you have a garden where water collects, that and to sustain a plant, you might think about that, which I love. That was the first time I've heard somebody offer a plant solution to that problem.
We have behind my house, there's a little old apartment building
Mhm.
that was retrofitted, and they forgot to close chimneys. So there used to be gazillion bats
Oh
there.
man.
I mean, 100, and they were wonderful. I would just sit in the backyard and watch the bats just eat mosquitoes left and right. And then they realized that, and so they closed the chimney. Now we don't have bats, and the mosquitoes have gone up. So hey,
Yeah.
exactly, global ecosystem. You need control. Natural controls are much better. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that comes up constantly in these webinars is that how much a fully functioning ecosystem helps to keep things in balance.
Yeah.
So someone else asked about regulations that limit planting. Are there places where that there is a limit to planting a biodiverse landscape, or is there limitations?
Yes. So I have a colleague, Dr. Damon Hall, who really studies that. So let me tell, there was a case in Baltimore that went all the way to the Supreme Court of Baltimore, in basically saying that homeowner associations severely limiting what homeowner associations can limits that they can have on dictating what you can do with your property.
Mhm.
So there are two sources. Let me step back. There are two sources for that. A is the private sector, which tend to be with the homeowner association, and there's the public sector, which tend to be, municipal or township ordinances. And if you all remember Hazel from Maplewood a few years back, and she fought Maplewood, got horrible press all over the world, because who's going to take Grandma Hazel to court when she wants to save the bees and the butterflies?
Mhm.
I mean, I have colleagues from Australia emailing me, says, is that where you are? Why don't you go to the court and be, file an amicus brief?
Mhm.
So a few years back, after the whole Hazel debacle, they took her to court twice. And it's really horrible, because when you look at those ordinances and restrictions, and these, I have a grandson that is doing the historical narrative going back. You can actually tie all those to restricted covenances tied with redlining. The whole purpose of they have no scientific basis, and tying property values to how your lawn looks is also very much tied to keeping people that you don't like out of your neighborhood.
Mhm.
Because what happened is, immigrants came in, you don't have money, you have green space, nobody else has have a freaking lawn. You grew food. You
Mhm.
said, no, you don't want to do, I don't want to have Irish, I don't want to have whatever next to me. Dominican said, okay. But that's not legal. But the way to keep them from getting here is like, you're not allowed to grow food in your yard. And furthermore, you have to grow this one grass that requires a lot of money. It requires watering, it requires mowing, it requires pesticides. So it forces them to go from an environment that you're making money from, you're
Mhm.
getting food, to an environment that you're putting a lot of money and wasting it. It runs away with the water. So it's a way of keeping people that don't have the money, that don't look like you, away from where you live, in a very legal, non-racist fashion.
So unsurprising, and really, fascinating. So many of the things that we fight against today are because of reasons like that. And I think that the question of like, how do you get buy-in from your neighbors and such comes up pretty often again. And I know a lot of the organizations that are in the partners do have like signage you can get that helps explain
Yeah.
what it is you're doing. There are a lot of ideas for like how to create some sense of order in the native landscape to help it look planned. I think that's part of the things that people.
So my wife, who is the expert, Dr. Zoran, the expert on communication here, she says native does not mean neglected.
Mhm.
Okay. And she's working with the Audubon and Dan Pearson to develop better messaging.
Mhm.
And what he said, less is more when it comes to communication. As scientists, we were extremely trained in something called the deficit model, in which I pound you with data and information until you come to my side. And that's not the best for people that are not trained like me. I've developed this one. Do you like salsa?
Mhm. Yeah,
Who doesn't like salsa? What do you need for a good salsa? Tell me the ingredients. How you make your salsa?
I don't make myself, but but I have
Okay,
people who
so
do.
write this
People
down.
that
A
like
good
people.
pico de gallo. A good pico de gallo. Okay.
Pico de gallo, tomato, onion, cilantro, peppers,
Chiles, yeah.
and yeah, and
Lime.
lime. Yes, of course,
The
lime.
lime, exactly. And just a little bit of olive oil, like a good olive oil, and a little bit of kosher salt.
Mhm.
It really like ups it up.
Yeah.
The lime and the salt really work well in all sort of Mexican, including tequila, especially tequila.
Exactly.
Okay. So
Universal.
and who doesn't like pizza and pasta and whatever? Well, in order for you to have tomatoes, you need a pollinator. And specifically, you need something like a bumblebee or a carpenter bee, because tomatoes cannot be pollinated by honeybees. Honeybees cannot buzz pollinate. Okay, they can't. So you need something that can come, buzz that flower, and the pollen comes out. Well, tomatoes are in the same family as chiles, as peppers, and eggplants, and potatoes, and tobacco, and tomatillos. You know, all of those require something like a bumblebee or carpenter bee. Onions. You also need bees, and honeybees cannot pollinate onions. And you need cilantro. And for that one, honeybees can pollinate cilantro. You need limes. And honeybees can pollinate limes. You need olive oil, and olive have to be bee pollinated. So all of a sudden, ask your neighbor the same thing. Give them, get a good salsa or pico de gallo recipe, and let them know, or make some and share it with them.
Yeah.
And say, why do I have this lawn that looks like that? Because I like my salsa.
Yeah.
Okay. I like my pico de gallo. I like my tequila.
I mean, can there be better support for these? Yeah,
exactly.
That's
Margaritas, exactly. And even for margaritas, it's worse, because agave, which is a plant that we make tequila from, is bat pollinated.
Yeah, I think I've heard a little bit about this recently, aren't they? There's some issues with the pollination.
Exactly. So they have invested huge amounts of money to protect and expand the nesting sites that the bats are located, because the bat population has been going down. And as the bat population goes down, the tequila prices go up. And next time you go Cinco de Mayo, so that's what happened. As pollinator diversity and abundances go up, food prices go down. I mean, pollinator diversity goes down, food prices go up, supply and demand basics, and nothing destabilizes a government faster than people going hungry.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it is so fascinating how interconnected and how really, like, ultimately how simple the solutions are, and it's just finding ways to get people to buy in. And salsa, pico de gallo, and all that good stuff are excellent arguments for having diverse yards.
So never, my recommendation for never start with the science. Always start with the food.
Better advice I've not heard. Perfect. So we had somebody who said that they were lucky enough to, their words, they were lucky enough to be in the mosquito and bird studies, and they're working to add yet more native plants and trying to nudge coworkers and neighbors. So it sounds like, food would be a good way to do that. And they're going to share this talk. And I remember last year, your grad students who presented a webinar as part of the series. I think it was really helpful for people to hear the variety, that not only do we have a diversity of plants, but we have a diversity of bees, and they have different roles to play, as you pointed out in your salsa scenario there. And so, things like that, just helping people be aware through talking. Great example. So I know somebody asked if you would come to talk to their neighbors about the mosquito situation.
So I know. So my grad student Trey, he should be finishing this year. He's also part of that other mosquito study that I think Gene Ponce has also
with the app where you can document.
And they have that app to document the mosquito. So my grad student is doing that, also helping with that. It's tough because as I said, any question in which we already have like a preconceived idea, or we have some kind of established version in our minds, it's it's like people that don't believe in climate change. I eat no amount of science will convince them. And actually, what we have found is that the more science you throw at them, the more entrenched they become, because somehow they believe it goes against their principles or their beliefs. So it's like you people say, oh, we have a bad mosquito. No, you haven't seen mosquitoes. I have been working in essentially wetlands in Mississippi, okay, in which the mosquitoes will cover you. With a very good friend who's a world expert in mosquitoes. I've been in Alaska, where you can actually see calves of reindeer that they look brown because they're covering mosquitoes. Those places have mosquitoes. We don't have mosquitoes.
I think
So it's all relative. Exactly, it's all relative. How much is and we live in this interior environment. We isolate ourselves so much from nature that a single mosquito, actually even worse, people. I've been at parties outside where, a mosquito just landed on me. They either, and said, no, that was not a mosquito. That was actually a bee. We don't know what we're living. People cannot tell the difference between a mosquito or a bee or a fly, or we don't have contact with nature, and we don't know what lives in our yards. We cannot tell things one from the other, which is very different. I mean, I grew up in the tropics, no air conditioner, but it wasn't terribly hot, nor it definitely wasn't cold at all. And you knew all the birds, you knew all the lizards, you knew all the frogs, you knew much greater diversity, and you knew all of it, and you interacted with it a lot. We have sealed our houses, and then we use antiseptic soaps, and we use antiseptic, antibacterial creams and whatnot. We want to isolate ourselves from nature, and all that has done is make us less nature welcoming. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, there's a disconnect there.
Yeah, I have another colleague who works on the amount of antibacterial and anti whatever found in the sewer in the United States. And the amounts are mind-boggling. How much stuff forget about medicines, the amount of like Xanax and Prozac that goes down the drain in the United States every day. It's really ridiculous. But yeah, we need to step back and yeah.
Yeah, I think COVID didn't help with that antiseptic thing either.
Oh, so I have a good one here. It says,
yeah,
let's have the rusty patch bumblebee. The answer, like everything in science, yes and no. And the no is bigger than the yes. So in the paper that we published in 2018 from my lab, yes, we did report the rusty patch bumblebee for St. Louis, because it was found at Litzinger Road Ecology Center in 1999. With that said, okay, and it was, one of them found 2 males and 5 workers. And at the time, he didn't know, he just collected them. And then it was observed again in 2002. We have been going extensively there since 2016, and especially since 2018. We have not found it. And this is our working hypothesis. Okay, when Litzinger was being established, a lot of the plant material that was brought in to Litzinger to restore the prairie was brought in from Springfield, Illinois, near Springfield, Illinois. The rusty patch bumblebee occurs there. And this was done, like always, in during the winter, when everything is dormant, the queens are in the ground. So we believe that that a queen or 2 might have been brought into Litzinger, and then they emerge, they establish colonies. But what happens is that it's only 1, maybe 2 worker queens. And, the moment that you have brothers and sisters marrying each other, things go haywire genetically and the population collapse.
Mhm.
So that's why if you see where the rusty patch bumblebee, the nearest rusty patch bumblebees that we have are around Springfield, Illinois. That's a very northern species. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, unintended consequences or surprising results of transplanting things. Well, excellent. Thank you for that. We've been taking questions for like 20-25 minutes. So I think we've had a lot of great comments here. Our community is definitely appreciative of you sharing your expertise and research with us, as am I. This has been a very interesting hour and change to spend. So thank you so much for being with us today and sharing what you're working on and things, giving us plenty to think about. As someone commented, they have a lot to ponder now. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
And we appreciate you. And hopefully those of you that are still with us, if you missed it at the beginning, I'm just going to put the survey for the Partners for Native Landscaping in the chat one more time. And as I said at the beginning, we will have this recording posted to the library's YouTube channel within a day or so. Probably might even be this afternoon yet. But the link, when it's captioned, the link will be sent out to registered participants, and you'll be able to share it at will and revisit this information too. So thank you again. Thank you so much, Dr. Camilla. We really appreciate your time
Thank
today.
you. Thank you very much.
Yes, of course. And hopefully we'll see you all at another webinar as part of the Partners for Native Landscaping and the upcoming weeks. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.